Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you a horror TV series named Containment. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins in a quarantine zone where law and order no longer exist. The only thought left for survivors is to stay alive. 13 days ago, a group of elementary school students, led by their teacher Katie, visited Atlanta Midtown Hospital. However, they were unaware of the terrifying presence within the hospital. A doctor was coughing violently in the isolation room, showing symptoms similar to the flu. The doctor recalled sharing a pen with a sick man who had the same symptoms. This matter caught the attention of the CDC because the seriously ill man was an illegal immigrant from Syria and might be carrying a highly infectious disease. At first, city authorities did not take the situation seriously. That changed when a woman arrived. Her name was Dr. Lummers, and she was from the CDC, responsible for dealing with urgent public safety events. Her appearance indicated that the infection incident was much more severe than imagined. The man from Syria showed severe fever symptoms accompanied by violent coughing. Soon, the attending physician, her boyfriend, and 2 nurses displayed the same symptoms. That is to say, everyone who had direct or indirect contact with the patients was infected. The unknown virus's contagiousness was astonishing. The only thing to do at the moment was to isolate the hospital to prevent its spread and find the Syrian man who left the hospital. Officer Lex from Atlanta Police Department immediately sent his fellow cop, Jake, to track the man down. Meanwhile, the group of students who had finished their activities were preparing to take the school bus back to school. Suddenly, a doctor ran over to inform them that no one could leave the hospital. The children were then placed in a separate room, waiting for the hospital's notification on when they could return. On the other hand, Officer Jake quickly located patient 0. After being discharged, he was picked up by the man in the hat, who was the patient's uncle. Fortunately, he had stayed home since leaving the hospital and did not go out anywhere. The family was puzzled as to why he was taken away for just a cold. In a panic, the Syrian man tried to run outside, but luckily there were police guarding the entrance. However, the police officer was unfortunately spat on by the patient. Jake quickly brought the man back to the hospital. After handing over his personal belongings, Jake was preparing to leave when he was informed that the hospital was sealed off and he could only leave after the lockdown was lifted. At this time, teacher Katie came for help, saying that 2 students were missing and might have gone to the lab to see the rats. Jake volunteered to go with her. The 2 made their way to explore the hospital. As they passed a room, they were shocked to find 2 unattended corpses. The hospital director then reported to the authorities that this was one of the most terrifying viruses in history. It could cause brain tissue degeneration, leading to manic behavior followed by massive bleeding. Patient 0 died in the afternoon, followed by the physician and her boyfriend. Moreover, the entire family of the uncle who lived with patient 0 also showed signs of infection. The hospital confirmed that the virus was a highly contagious and deadly variant of avian influenza. Surprisingly, a vial of biological agent was found in patient 0's personal belongings. Dr. Lummers began to suspect that this was a biological terrorist attack from abroad and decided to implement the highest level of quarantine measures. The authorities immediately executed the quarantine. A train that had just arrived at the station had to embark again without a stop. All passengers were informed that the platform was about to close. The area within 10 kilometers of the hospital and patient 0's uncle's house was about to be sealed off. Lex called to comfort Jake, saying he would try to get him out of the quarantine zone. At this moment, Jake was devastated. He had just found the 2 missing students with teacher Katie, only to encounter a doctor coughing violently in front of him. He was terrified and wanted to leave the hospital. However, Dr. Lummers told Lex that from now on, no one was allowed to enter or leave the quarantine area. Soon, the main roads connecting the quarantine zone to the outside world were all blocked by fences. Residents on both sides were discussing the situation, not even knowing why this was happening. Soon after, at a press conference, Dr. Lummers told the public that to prevent the spread of the virus, everyone was urged to stay at home and avoid going out or gathering. The virus could only be transmitted through bodily fluids, with an incubation period of 16 to 48 hours. If everything went well, the quarantine would be lifted after 48 hours. The sudden lockdown caught everyone off guard. In the hospital, Jake felt a chill as he looked at the infected patients in the isolation ward, one of whom was the doctor who had coughed in front of him earlier. Many people were forced to live on the streets, separated from their loved ones. The dissatisfied public stood outside the barricades, expressing their anger. Lex tried in vain to calm the people's emotions and could only order the last fence to be forcibly closed. However, he realized that his girlfriend had not left the quarantine zone. Lex called her name, but the fence was already electrified. At that moment, he saw one of his subordinates in conflict with a man and learned that the man's girlfriend was inside. The man wanted to go in and be with his girlfriend. Lex comforted him by saying that his own girlfriend was also inside, but for the safety of every citizen, everyone had to abide by the quarantine regulations. Outside the quarantine zone, the command center was in chaos. Dr. Lummers believed that the top priority was to stabilize the quarantine residents and make them stay at home to avoid mass infections. They needed to take good care of the infected patients and prevent them from spreading the virus further. The hospital director informed everyone that there were 9 confirmed cases, including patient zero's 5 family members, 2 doctors, and 2 nurses, all of whom were put in quarantine. Lex felt relieved. He first called his girlfriend, asking her to stay in her company and not go anywhere or have contact with anyone. Then he called to comfort his friend Jake, saying that the hospital director had confirmed that Jake was not infected, so he could be at ease. However, this was not enough to ease Jake's resentment. As he complained, he browsed through the phone of patient zero's cousin and accidentally saw a photo of him with a white-haired girl. Jake suddenly felt a chill down his spine because the hospital had actually missed a virus contact. At this point, the girl had already shown symptoms of infection, causing panic at the command center. If she were outside the quarantine zone, the consequences would be unimaginable. However, it was almost impossible to trace the girl's movements. Jake showed the photo to patient zero's family members, but they were resentful and refused to share any information. The aunt cooperated and mentioned that she was just a girlfriend her son had recently met and had left after attending a family gathering 3 days ago. Lex found the girl's address from the registration and immediately led the team to search for her. But her father told them that she had gone to a party yesterday and hadn't returned yet. This made things even more complicated. The girl's phone had been switched off since yesterday afternoon. Fortunately, the last location of the phone signal was within the quarantine zone. Lex reviewed many surveillance videos and finally found the suspected infected girl getting into a white sedan. After tracking the car, they found it stopped in front of a building. Luckily, the quarantine fence had been built by then, indicating that the girl was still within the quarantine area. To everyone's relief, the car had not moved until now. Meanwhile, Jake took on the responsibility again, bringing 2 medical members to the building where the girl was located. They found many people lying on the living room floor, surrounded by bottles and food, apparently partying late into the night. Jake woke up a young couple and asked if the girl was there. After confirming it, Jake immediately searched the rooms and finally found the bloodstained girl in an upstairs bedroom. The hospital quickly confirmed that all 7 young people who attended the party with the girl were infected. But the news did not mention where these young people had been before and who they had been in contact with. Jake was the first to realize the problem, as the virus was about to spiral out of control. This meant that the quarantine would be extended indefinitely. The hospital director informed everyone that 2 of patient zero's family members had died, and several more infected people were added to the quarantine zone. The girl looked at her infected boyfriend with panic and despair. Disappointed, the hospital director told teacher Katie that the hospital would lift the lockdown tomorrow, but the quarantine of the entire zone would continue. Katie was concerned because she and pre-students lived outside the zone. Now they could only stay in the hospital. Jake was in the same situation. He originally planned to stay in the police station, but had developed feelings for Katie after spending a few days together. He made the resolute decision to stay in the hospital and face the challenges with Katie. Since it was impossible to trace all the infected people, Dr. Lummers had to make the difficult decision to extend the quarantine. Lex was worried about the infected, and Dr. Lummers just looked at him without saying a word, indicating that the infected were being abandoned. Soon after, countless shipping containers were brought in, preparing to seal off the quarantine zone completely and also to block everyone's view. This also meant that the lockdown was being escalated. As long as it was well controlled, no one outside would know what was happening inside the quarantine zone. Journalists were curious about whether the situation inside the quarantine zone was under control. The official response was that everything was under control, and as long as everyone followed the rules, the virus would be quickly contained. However, in just one day, a large number of people were infected, and all the patients gathered in the only hospital in the city. The isolation wards were already full, and the increasing number of deaths left the medical employees overwhelmed with work. While maintaining public order, Officer Jake also had to help the hospital incinerate bodies. Lex called his girlfriend inside the zone, warning her that the lockdown might last a long time and she should prepare enough food supplies now. Moreover, with few police officers inside, personal safety was a concern. Lex repeatedly requested Dr. Lummers to send more police force inside the quarantine zone. However, Dr. Lummers insisted that the regulations prohibited anyone from entering or leaving in order to effectively control the virus. She also believed that in order to stop the spread of panic, they must stop the circulation of negative news online about the quarantine zone. Lex soon found the video's publisher, a conspiracy vlogger named Leo. Although Leo was located outside the quarantine zone, he had 2 team members inside who were constantly filming footage. Leo was responsible for editing the sensational content and uploading it to the internet. Lex went to Leo's home alone, hoping to persuade him to stop spreading the content that might cause chaos. However, Leo insisted that all citizens had the right to know the truth about the virus. After this incident, Leo became even more aggressive, uploading even more sensational content online. Meanwhile, Lex had to call Officer Jake in the quarantine zone again and ask him to maintain public order with all available forces and prevent the impending chaos. Upon hearing this, Jake was speechless. He now had to spend half a day every day helping the hospital incinerate bodies, and there were only 11 police officers inside the zone. Teacher Katie had been staying at the hospital, taking care of 4 students who originally lived outside the quarantine zone. However, the children felt bored staying indoors, so Katie took them to the rooftop for some fresh air. The sunlight seemed to dispel all the gloom. Suddenly, one student named Thomas said he needed to use the restroom. Katie was worried about his safety and followed him. Just then, a blood-spitting infected person blocked his path, shouting that he wanted to go home and pulled off Thomas's glove. The poor child, staring at the blood on his hand, was terrified. Due to his close contact with an infected person, he was soon isolated and had to wait 48 hours for observation results. Soon after, teacher Katie found that Thomas had disappeared. It turned out that Thomas's father had come to take his son away. Katie tried to stop him, as the child was a suspected infected person. However, the father didn't care, pulling out a gun and threatening that he didn't want his son to be alone in the isolation room. Watching Thomas being taken away, Katie felt devastated. She knew that even calling the police would be futile, as Officer Jake was busy. At this time, Jake was dealing with a robbery at a supermarket. Due to the increasing shortage of supplies in the quarantine zone, the supermarket owner had doubled the prices of goods. The owner's daughter, Teresa, didn't agree with her mother's doings and complained of her boyfriend, who was outside the zone. Upon closer inspection, the man in the video was the same young man named Xander, who had previously tried to enter the quarantine zone to be with his girlfriend, but was stopped by Lex. Just then, a group of armed robbers entered the supermarket. Teresa wanted to call the police, but the line was busy. She wanted to rush out to help, but fortunately, Jake happened to be patrolling nearby. A confrontation between the 2 parties ensued. Jake didn't want the conflict to escalate, so he pointed to the security camera in the corner and said that if they put down their items and left, no responsibility would be pursued. The robbers reluctantly left empty-handed. On the other side, Lex approached Dr. Lummers again, requesting additional police for the quarantine zone. Relying on 11 police officers to deal with 4,000 panicked people would sooner or later lead to big problems. Dr. Lummers still emphasized that as long as everyone followed the rules, nothing would happen. Unable to disobey orders, Lex left in frustration. All he could do now was help Jake as much as possible. The 2 agreed to meet inside a shipping container connected to the exit. Lex prepared some guns and ammunition for Jake, but Jake felt it was far from enough, because 2 of them had even quit the temporarily assembled team. What they lacked the most was manpower. Lex was also desperate, so he could only ask Jake to stand through the situation. Later, Leo's 2 informants discovered there was a ladder at the edge of the quarantine zone that led to the rooftop, allowing people to climb up and jump onto the containers, thus escaping the quarantine zone. They were all excited, knowing that exposing this to the public would definitely cause a sensation. However, Leo noticed one of his men had a slight cough, a sign of virus infection. Soon after, Lex saw a video about the escape ladder on the internet. He immediately sent guards to surround the containers near the ladder and prepared to remove the escape ladder with a lift. At the same time, he instructed Jake inside the quarantine zone to stop any people trying to escape. As time went on, residents who wanted to escape gathered up, and some even tried to break through the blockade. Due to the limited police force, one person slipped through, climbing up the escape ladder and successfully reaching the containers. Officer Lex drew his gun and warned the person. However, a gunshot rang out, and the escapee fell, having been shot. It turned out that an officer inside the quarantine zone had fired the shot, as his wife and children were outside, and he couldn't let the virus spread further. This officer handed over his badge, stating that the pressure was too much and he couldn't continue his work. This incident led to an escalation of the blockade, with Dr. Lommers ordering the cutting off of the internet and phone lines within the quarantine zone, retaining only communication for official institutions such as hospitals. Lex was reluctant to take the order, but she insisted it was to better control the deteriorating situation. Feeling frustrated, Lex had to explain to the public that it was to prevent the spread of panic and make the quarantine zone safer. At this point, the hospital hall was filled with bodies. The person in charge told Katie it was a necessary measure since there were too many patients, and there was not only a lack of space, but also a shortage of medication. To prevent anyone from breaking through the blockade, Lex further strengthened the guard and vigilance. That night, he spotted a sneaky figure approaching the blockade line. Lex called out to stop the person, but the individual seemed not to hear him. He used a steel pipe to destroy the electrified wire fence, then leaped over it quickly. Lex had no choice but to shoot him down. It turned out the man was Xander. His plan to enter the quarantine zone to accompany his girlfriend failed again. It turns out Xander's girlfriend was 9 months pregnant and he wanted to be with her all the time. Lex understood this, but he couldn't make an exception to him. As he left the ward, Lex met the vlogger Leo again. Leo thought Xander being shot was a big story to report, but Lex knew what he was up to and warned him to leave the hospital immediately. Leo, however, didn't care and challenged Lex that not everything he did was right as he expected. That afternoon, Lex was preparing for a televised speech, but he couldn't stand it and threw away the speech in his hand. Lex told his superiors that he just wanted to protect the people in the quarantine zone, but he was not a politician. After saying that, he stormed out of the car. He planned to go to the hospital to talk to Xander, but found out that he had already left the ward. From a nurse, Lex learned that Xander was taken away by Leo. Lex guessed they might be sneaking into the quarantine zone, so he asked his men to track their whereabouts. Unfortunately, it was too late. A report came in that a man had broken through the blockade and entered the quarantine zone. It turned out that this had been planned by Leo all along. He helped Xander enter the quarantine zone, and in return, Xander helped him film some video footage. When Leo received new information from the zone, he was devastated because 2 of his team members had already died from the infection. Xander finally met with his girlfriend Teresa, but a man with a gun suddenly appeared. It turned out that the supermarket owned by Teresa's family had been taken away. Just a day earlier, the robbers had come back again. As they were moving supplies, another group of robbers came and forced everyone to put the supplies back in the car and planned to use the supermarket as their gang base. Due to the virus spreading faster than expected, the initially planned 48-hour quarantine had to be extended. This led to chaos in the quarantine zone. The communication network was cut off, and food shortages became pressing. By the 7th day of the blockade, people had started catching animals on the street to stave off hunger, and even searching for leftovers in garbage piles. This place had become a paradise for criminals. Xander finally arrived at his girlfriend's family supermarket, only to find it occupied by the robbers. To ensure that his pregnant girlfriend had enough food, Xander had no choice but to join the gang, helping the boss sell the food in the supermarket to make money. At this time, Dr. Lommers was furious because someone had posted the horrors of the quarantine zone online. She warned the police chief that from now on, media reports must be positive and uplifting. She then gave Lex a new task. She had already contacted the Emergency Management Agency and prepared 50,000 servings of food for the quarantine zone. She wanted Lex to be responsible for distributing the food. Lex was somewhat excited after hearing this, thinking that Dr. Lommers had finally done something humane. But when he was about to discuss the action plan with the chief, Dr. Lommers interrupted him, ordering him to deliver the food to the quarantine zone by tomorrow. Lex was dumbfounded after hearing this, because there wasn't enough manpower in the quarantine zone to handle the mission. However, Dr. Lummers believed that it had already been 7 days, and most of the food had started to spoil. If they waited another day, there might be riots. Lex didn't dare to argue and reluctantly agreed. Inside the quarantine zone, Jake was grumbling about the lack of police officers available for the task at hand. Lex, however, remained resolute in his determination to complete the mission. He then handed Jake the keys to his house, asking him to pass them on to his girlfriend so she would have a safe haven inside the quarantine zone. That afternoon, at a press conference, Dr. Lummers announced that the CDC would distribute food in the quarantine zone and specify the collection points. Lex's girlfriend, Jana, saw the news. She and her co-workers had been staying at their office, also facing food shortages. However, their office basement was occupied by a gang of street racers, making it risky for them to leave. To be safe, Jana decided to go alone to collect the food. The next day, Lex was outside the quarantine zone, organizing his team to load the food, preparing to deliver it to those inside. With only 6 officers available to maintain order, they had to be cautious and proceed slowly. Jake was busy, as a large number of refugees had already gathered at the distribution point. He had to make sure everyone maintained a safe distance to prevent the spread of the virus. However, Dr. Lummers even had large crowds gathered together, which would only accelerate the transmission of the virus. As the first batch of supplies arrived, the starving people could no longer worry about the risk of infection. Their top priority was to get their hands on food. Jake spotted a young girl holding a baby, searching for something to eat. He was about to help her when he realized she had already been infected with the virus. With no other choice, he asked his colleagues to take her to the hospital first. Soon after, John arrived at the scene. Jake first gave her a box of food, then handed her the keys to Lex's house. Just as Jake thought he had successfully completed his mission, something unexpected happened. These refugees were collecting supplies distributed by the authorities, when suddenly, a group of armed robbers stormed in. They were all armed and outnumbered the police at the scene. The robbers wanted to take all the supplies. Jake tried to stop them, but the gang leader warned him that if anyone tried to stop them, he would order his men to open fire on the crowd. Jake had no choice but to compromise. He watched helplessly as the robbers loaded boxes of supplies onto their vehicles. Jake made one last effort to persuade the leader, arguing that stealing food from the refugees was essentially taking their lives. Unexpectedly, the robber revealed that they had already planned to sell the supplies back to the refugees later. When Lex learned about this incident, he didn't have any good solutions either. There were too many civilians at the scene, and any conflict would undoubtedly harm the innocent. Lex could only vent his frustration on Dr. Lummers. Lex went to persuade the police chief not to let someone like her continue to command the operation. Otherwise, the situation would only worsen. But the chief told Lex that Dr. Lummers was sent by higher-ups. Local police officers could not afford to offend her, otherwise they might lose their jobs. Lex sensed that there was more to the story and began to suspect that the authorities were deliberately hiding something. Sure enough, Lex's suspicions were soon confirmed. Jake contacted him to report important information. Teacher Katie had discovered that the physician and her boyfriend's time of death was earlier than that of patient 0, and that experimental rats were sent to the hospital before the virus outbreak, especially since it was a non-research facility. It was possible that the hospital had known about the virus's existence at that time. When the hospital director was challenged, he evaded answering all these questions, making Katie become even more convinced of her suspicions. She went to check the patient records and found that a page had been torn out. Katie believed that someone was deliberately destroying evidence and decided to discuss the matter with Jake. While incinerating bodies, Jake discovered that the little girl he had encountered earlier had died. He realized that if Katie's suspicions were true, then patient 0 was not the young man from Syria, but rather the physician or her boyfriend. It seems that the disease control experts might be hiding something. Jake recalled that when he handled the bodies of the physician and her boyfriend, he hadn't found any personal belongings, especially any identification for the boyfriend. It was as if someone had deliberately cleaned it up. Thinking about that, Jake immediately reported the matter to Lex. Lex, who had long suspected something fishy about the incident, told Jake that they needed to find evidence, such as hospital surveillance footage. Jake said he would do his best to investigate. As he left the container, a bald police officer named Donald emerged from the other side. He had originally been one of Lex's subordinates outside the quarantine zone. During the daytime supply distribution, he accidentally fell into the quarantine zone from a shipping container. Lex refused to let him climb back out and instead left him inside to help Jake maintain order. However, Officer Donald didn't report to Jake. Instead, he stealthily made a satellite phone call, stating that he would complete the mission as instructed by the chief. It turned out that he had intentionally entered the quarantine zone, and it was unclear what secret mission the chief had assigned him. Meanwhile, Jake and Katie were discussing the collection of evidence in the hospital. As the two passed a corridor, Katie saw a girl locked in an isolation ward. She was the sister of Thomas, who had previously been taken from the hospital by her father. The girl told Katie that her father had taken Thomas home, but her father had died of the virus. Now she was also quarantined here, leaving only her little brother at home. She hoped that Katie could look after her brother. Jake decided to go with Katie to find Thomas. The two quickly arrived at their destination. As expected, the father of the boy had passed away. However, Thomas was nowhere to be found. As they searched the surrounding area, they encountered a group of street racers. These people showed no respect for the police. Jake could no longer bear it and shot down one of the racers, finally driving the group away. This showed just how bad the public security situation had become. Soon after, the two found Thomas on a park bench, giving water to an infected person. The patient's sweat dripped onto Thomas's hand, but he remained calm. Thomas was then taken back to the hospital for observation. This was the second time Thomas had been in contact with an infected person's bodily fluids. If he was still fine, it could mean that he was a carrier of antibodies, which would help in finding a cure for the virus. Meanwhile, outside the zone, Lex was trying to access the hospital's surveillance footage. Suddenly, the chief informed him that due to the failure of Lex's food supply operation, Dr. Lummers would request the military to take over the quarantine work. Upon hearing this, Lex was furious, thinking that he was not the one to take the blame. The chief gave him a glance, making him realize that all of this had been deliberately orchestrated by Dr. Lummers, who wanted to take control of the quarantine zone. After that, Lex was determined to investigate secretly and reveal the truth to the public. Inside the quarantine zone, the virus rages on, causing suffering and chaos. Yet outside the zone, life seems to go on as usual. The TV is filled with heated discussions about an upcoming sports game. Lex has never given up on investigating the truth behind the virus outbreak. He goes to the conspiracy vlogger, Leo, and tells him that the CDC might have deceived the public regarding patient zero. Although Leo is still filled with guilt for the death of his colleague, who died in the quarantine zone while working for him, he also senses that the authorities are deliberately hiding something. The problem now is that if Lex uses his authority to access the hospital surveillance footage stored in the data center, he might be discovered by his superiors. Leo, however, is an expert in such matters and comes up with a plan. They just need to forge a search warrant. Sure enough, it doesn't take long for Leo to obtain the hospital surveillance footage. Unfortunately, it seems that the files have been erased and they must find someone to recover the data. Lex thinks of the perfect person for the job, his girlfriend Jana, a top-tier data recovery expert. However, getting the video to her will require some effort. The military has now taken full control of the quarantine zone's defense, and Lex uses the excuse of delivering ammunition to Jake in order to enter the container. Once inside, he instructs Jake to get the video to Jana at all costs. When Lex comes out of the container, he must undergo a search by the soldiers to prevent him from carrying anything out. At this time, Jana's situation isn't much better either. Although they've just received a box of supplies, there are too many people to feed, and the supplies won't last long. To make matters worse, the office's air conditioning has stopped working. The building maintenance officer volunteers to fix the circuit. Worried about potential dangers, Jana decides to accompany him to the power distribution room. Located in the basement, the room was previously occupied by a group of street racers. It now seems to be abandoned, with trash and debris scattered everywhere. Inside a cabinet, they find a dead body, likely a staff member on duty. The two of them head straight to do their task. After some maintenance, the circuit is successfully restarted, and the air conditioning starts working again. However, just then, the surveillance footage shows two people trying to enter the building. Jana recognizes one of them as Xander, a previous visitor who helped Lex deliver a message to her. Standing beside him is his pregnant girlfriend, Teresa. Without hesitation, Jana unlocks the elevator and decides to take them in. It's shown that she had been living in the supermarket occupied by thieves previously. While helping move supplies, her boyfriend Xander discovered someone sneezing and became vigilant. So he suggested to Teresa that they leave the dangerous place. He explained to the gang leader that one of his men has been infected and asked if they can find another place to give birth. The gang leader walked into the storage room where his infected man was, and a gunshot was heard. Xander doesn't give up on his plan to leave and seeks help from Teresa's mother. At this moment, a police officer arrives at the supermarket. It's Officer Donald, who secretly entered the quarantine zone with a hidden mission. Knowing that they are gangsters, he proposes to join them, claiming he can maintain contact with the outside world through his satellite phone. His superior will call daily for verification, and if it's not him who answers, the line will be cut. The gang leader abandons the idea of killing the cop, raising his hands in welcome. Everyone watches this scene unfold, and Teresa's mother decides to help her daughter escape. She instructs Xander to take Teresa out through the back door, while she distracts the gangsters. With her mother's help, Teresa and Xander finally arrive safely at the chemical company where Jonna works. While Teresa was organizing the baby clothes her mother had prepared, she found a satellite phone in her backpack. It belonged to Officer Donald. Just then, the surveillance footage showed two figures approaching. It was the gangsters holding Teresa's mother hostage. With no other choice, they unlocked the elevator to let them in. It turned out the gangsters were after the satellite phone. Jonna knew they were only after money and didn't want to harm anyone, so she opened the glass door. However, once they got the phone, they didn't release the hostage as planned, and they intended to take Xander as well, since the supermarket couldn't operate well without him. Just as everyone was at a stalemate, Jake appeared with a gun in hand, causing the gangsters to flee. Jake had come to deliver the video to Jonna and unexpectedly helped resolve the situation. After expressing her gratitude, Jonna prepared to restore the video data. However, she found that the data was not only damaged, but also encrypted, which would require a significant amount of time to recover. Suddenly, gunshots were heard from downstairs. Everyone rushed to check the surveillance video and discovered that the street racers who were lurking in the basement had broken in. Jake recognized that they were the criminals, most of whom were hypocrites and had a tendency for violence. They must have learned from the previous gangsters that there were many chemicals in this building that could be used to produce drugs, and were now planning to rob them. At this point, the maintenance officer reminded everyone that although the elevator had a password lock, the intruders could access this floor through the ventilation ducts and the rooftop fire exit. Everyone split up to take action. Jake and one of Jana's colleagues went to the rooftop to seal a fire exit, while the others blocked the company's ventilation ducts. Jake and his partner acted quickly. As soon as they reached the rooftop, they encountered two street racers scouting the area. Without much effort, Jake took them down and began to seal a fire exit. On the other side, Jonna was leading the group to overturn tables onto the ventilation ducts when they suddenly heard noises coming from beneath the floor. Everyone hurriedly pressed down on the table, but the racers were too strong and were about to crawl out of the duct. In desperation, Jonna ignited the gas and sprayed it fiercely into the duct, finally forcing the attackers to retreat. Although they were safe for the moment, everyone was frightened, and one colleague couldn't stop complaining that they should have just given the racers what they wanted instead of fighting back. When Jake returned after sealing the fire exit, Jonna noticed that the complaining colleague had disappeared. Looking at the descending elevator, she realized he had actually gone to negotiate with the street racers. However, the elevator didn't stop at the first floor, but rose again to the 8th floor. Everyone nervously watched the elevator, and as the doors opened, a body rolled out. It was the colleague who had gone downstairs. Jake warned everyone not to go outside, and sure enough, there was an infected attacker hiding in the elevator. Now everyone panicked, knowing that the attackers must have been infected. Not long after, the lights suddenly went out. The racers had cut off the power. At the same time, there was a noise coming from the elevator. The maintenance officer instantly understood that the elevator lock had failed due to the power outage, and the racers were likely to climb up the elevator shaft. Jonna thought that they just needed to restore power to the elevator. She knew of a backup power source nearby. Jake wanted to go with her, but Jonna refused, saying that the destination was not far away, and she could be back in 5 minutes. Not long after Jonna left, the racers had already climbed up. Just as they were about to open the elevator door, the power was restored in time. Jana's colleague quickly activated the elevator lock, repelling the racers once again. Just then, Jonna saw from the surveillance cameras that more attackers had rushed into the building. She prepared to hurry back and inform the others. As she passed the stairwell, she found the previous robber dead, but the satellite phone was still beside him. Jonna picked it up and called her boyfriend Lex for help. Hearing his girlfriend's voice, Lex became emotional. Suddenly, Jana's scream came through the phone. She had been attacked. Fortunately, the attacker was weak, and Jana eventually overpowered him, but the phone was damaged during the fight. She noticed more attackers following her, and hurriedly opened the access control to return to the company. Unexpectedly, these attackers came prepared, bringing a chainsaw to force their way through the door. There seemed to be no way out, so they had no choice but to fight the attackers to the death. Meanwhile, Lex was frantic, but couldn't offer any help at the moment. The military had taken over the lockdown, and the local police were assigned to clear the surrounding vegetation to create a buffer zone. Lex refused and went to argue with the captain, but to no avail. Knowing his girlfriend was in danger, Lex couldn't just stand by. He decided to sneak in and find her on his own. He turned off the power to the fence and found a secluded spot to climb up. However, just as he was about to climb, the military captain caught him red-handed. Now, the quarantine zone has been under lockdown for 9 days. With the severe shortage of supplies, the isolated population is becoming increasingly restless. Many criminals have started looting and burning with impunity. At this moment, a group of robbers are breaking into Jana's company that stores chemical agents. The people taking refuge inside are panicking, knowing the dire consequences if they fall into the hands of the intruders. As they watch the robbers forcefully cut open the door, Jana has a plan. She knows that the lab stores many flammable and explosive chemicals. So she gathers all the flammable chemicals and leads everyone to a room in a safe place, making all necessary precautions. It doesn't take long for the robbers to break in, and their primary objective is to seize the chemicals. They gravitate toward the materials, but Jake, hiding on the side, shoots the flammable chemicals without hesitation. Jana's plan works, and all the robbers are turned into charred corpses. Just then, a robber suddenly jumps out and grabs Teresa's mother, biting her. Although the robber was soon shot dead, nobody knows whether he was infected with the virus or not. To avoid being a burden, the mother decides to isolate herself outside, even though Teresa is reluctant to let her mother go. In the end, she can only shed tears and watch her mother leave. After that, Jana fixes the hospital's surveillance video and Jake to uncover the truth behind the virus incident. After returning to the hospital, Jake immediately studied the surveillance video with Katie. As expected, the CDC had deceived everyone. The video showed that before the physician received the Syrian man, she had been in close contact with her boyfriend, who had known he was infected with the virus. After a few phone calls, he had hidden all of his personal belongings and began isolating himself. This meant that the physician's boyfriend was the real patient zero. Knowing the truth, Jake arranged to meet Lex at the entrance to the quarantine fence. Jake was curious why Lex was wearing casual clothes. Lex told Jake that he had been suspended from duty for breaking into the quarantine zone to rescue his girlfriend the day before. However, Lex didn't give up. Instead, he went to Dr. Lammers and asked her to allow him to enter the zone. Unexpectedly, Dr. Lammers agreed, but only allowed him to enter once. Upon learning that Jana was safe, he was relieved. Jake then gave the hospital video to Lex and asked him to identify the physician's boyfriend as patient zero. After that, Lex turned to Leo for help, asking him to investigate the physician's boyfriend. Leo did not disappoint Lex. Soon, they found out that patient zero was called Burns, a microbiologist, but there was no record of his work history on the internet. Someone was deliberately concealing his information, and they needed a professional to investigate. At this point, Lex received a call from Dr. Lammers and was instructed to go to the command center. Dr. Lammers restored Lex's duty as she had an urgent mission for him. It turns out a child was found in the quarantine zone, and the doctors hoped that they could use his blood to develop a cure for the virus. Lex was tasked with bringing the child out of the quarantine zone. 2 days earlier, Dr. Victor, the lead virus researcher, was leading several experts in an experiment using rats. Before, Thomas had contact with an infected person, but did not show any signs of infection. Dr. Victor thought that Thomas might have developed antibodies, so he injected the rat with the boy's serum. Surprisingly, they survived for 48 hours. However, during the experiment, a doctor was accidentally bitten by one of the rats, and Dr. Victor had to isolate him. Dr. Victor was excited to report his antibody findings to his mentor, who pointed out that even if everything went smoothly, it would take at least 9 months to develop a vaccine. Nevertheless, Dr. Victor did not give up. He soon made another discovery that Thomas' body could fight the virus on its own. Dr. Victor immediately reported it to the CDC. Dr. Lommers decided to take Thomas out to study the cure because the CDC had better research resources. Dr. Victor was disappointed, but he could not object. On the other side, Lex formulated a plan and decided to open a temporary gate in a hidden location. He did not want to use the same path he had with Jake because many people were monitoring it. According to his plan, Jake would bring Thomas there tomorrow morning. That night, Leo found Lex and told him about an important clue he discovered. It was a biological parcel from the CDC received by patient 0, Burns, just 2 days before the virus outbreak. Although it wasn't explicitly labeled as a virus sample, Leo was sure the CDC must have a duplicate record. Lex could easily look into it. At this point, however, Lex had more to deal with. Compared to seeking the truth, finding the cure for the virus was clearly more urgent. But due to the confidentiality, Lex couldn't tell Leo about his contacts. This infuriated Leo, who stormed out of the room. Lex felt guilt. After all, it was he who had initiated the investigation into the virus, so he turned his attention to the delivery details of the parcel. Even though he wasn't sure of its contents, Lex discovered that the shipping fee had been paid by the virus lead researcher, Dr. Victor. This was a big discovery, and further investigation could yield more clues. Later, Lex arrived at the border of the isolation zone, planning to pick up Thomas. As he looked up at the temporary entrance, there were many guards standing, and some were already cutting open the containers. Lex challenged the captain, blaming him for not doing the job secretly, but the captain ignored him. On the second day, Thomas was released from the isolation room and said goodbye to his friends as the delivery time was approaching. One classmate even kissed him on the cheek. Meanwhile, outside the quarantine zone, Lex was ready with even Dr. Lommers present, indicating the importance of the task. Everything was in place, and they were just waiting for Jake to deliver Thomas. At that moment, Jake and Katie were pushing a truck with Thomas on board, disguised as cargo. They managed to reach the designated location and place Thomas at the entrance of a container. Just as Lex and Dr. Lommers were about to take him away, several soldiers rushed in. While Jake and Katie were still in the vicinity, they heard Thomas shouting, and the quarantine residents around the area had also discovered the existence of the passage. They ran over and banged on the container, trying to stop Jake and Katie from taking Thomas away. At that moment, Dr. Victor ran over, shouting at them not to touch the child because something went wrong. It turns out 10 minutes before this, Dr. Victor had seen some doctors celebrating in the ward. He found out that a previously bitten colleague had successfully passed the quarantine period and that the rat that bit him had been injected with Thomas serum. This indicated that a cure for the virus was imminent. However, the colleague suddenly felt unwell and coughed up a lot of blood. Dr. Victor realized that Thomas was an asymptomatic carrier of the virus and could still infect others. He knew that under no circumstances could Thomas be allowed to leave the quarantine area. He then called the military and reported the situation. Unfortunately, Lex and Dr. Lommers had already been exposed to Thomas and were ordered to isolate themselves inside the container for 48 hours. Meanwhile, Leo sneaked into the apartment where Dr. Victor used to live. The exported experimental records showed that the virus was likely created by Dr. Victor. While the truth about the virus was coming to light, the turmoil within the quarantine zone became severe. Countless isolated people shouted crazily. They could not wait a moment longer to leave. Inside the container, Dr. Lommers was frightened, and she began to blame Lex for their predicament. He was now too busy to argue with her. Instead, he noticed that all the people who had gathered together had suddenly dispersed. Lex realized that this was not a good sign. As Lex had suspected, the isolated people had gathered together and began to march on the streets. More and more people joined, including many infected individuals. With so many people gathering in one place, they were at risk of being wiped out by the highly infectious virus. Meanwhile, Dr. Lommers continued to complain, and Lex could no longer stand it, challenging her how she could make so many containers arrive in one day. Apparently, he believed that she was prepared in advance for the virus outbreak. The people, who have been isolated for 13 days, discovered that the authorities had secretly opened a passage and were preparing to transport someone outside. In anger, they took to the streets in protest, and some even began to attack the shipping container. The chaos on the scene attracted more attackers, and under their malicious destruction, the crowd became even more agitated, causing the situation to become out of control. Meanwhile, inside the containment container, Lex kept blaming Dr. Lommers for hiding something. Dr. Lommers replied that now is not the time to discuss conspiracies. They should focus all our efforts on dealing with the disaster. At this time, someone brought a walkie-talkie, and the captain wanted to speak with Dr. Lummers. The number of protesters was increasing, and they could break through the wall and escape at any time. He had already placed food supplies near the gate to appease the crowd, but Dr. Lummers felt it was not enough and arranged for snipers to deter them. However, the captain strongly opposed it, as they would not shoot at civilians. On the streets of the containment zone, Xander and his girlfriend Teresa were walking, preparing to take refuge at their grandmother's house and have Teresa give birth there. Since the chemical company was attacked by criminals, the scene was in chaos and others also wanted to leave. Therefore, Xander and Teresa did not plan to stay any longer. However, as soon as they arrived on the street, they found a large crowd of protesters. Xander wanted to wait for them to move further away before continuing on their way, but soon after, Teresa saw a figure in the crowd that looked like her mother. She wanted to call out to her, but Xander held on to his girlfriend, saying that he would go find her mother for her. But when Xander caught up with the figure, he found out that it was not Teresa's mother. Suddenly, an infected person ran up seeking help, and Xander was startled and quickly took off his jacket in fear that he would get infected. Meanwhile, Jake and Katie have taken the asymptomatic carrier, Thomas, back to the hospital for re-isolation. Dr. Victor has also put himself under quarantine due to his close contact with Thomas. Jake and Katie have grown closer during this time, but their intimacy is interrupted when Katie's son informs her that 2 other students have been taken away by the bus driver. They were trying to join the protesters and escape from the quarantine zone. So Jake rushes to stop them, but when he comes back, he realizes that Katie is nowhere to be found. He changes into plain clothes to avoid being targeted by angry protesters and searches for Katie. Meanwhile, Katie witnesses one of the students being hit by a car after she hides in it to escape. She takes the student out of the car and tries to find someone who can help, but there are too many people looking for help, escaping, or venting their anger. Xander returns to the chaotic crowd without his girlfriend, who has disappeared, while Jake is also searching for Katie in the chaos. At this moment, Dr. Lummers in the container received another call from the captain. Apparently, the food supply was not enough to appease the anger of the people. Dr. Lummers was anxious and requested to use water guns and snipers. However, the captain refused again, stating that he planned to send a team of soldiers to suppress the crowd in order to minimize casualties. Dr. Lummers immediately stopped him, and Lex also chimed in, saying that this would be sending their men to their deaths. However, the captain was insistent, saying that his soldiers were not like the shitty local police officers. As the one in charge, Dr. Lummers stopped the captain from taking action. However, he had already prepared for this and said he had received authorization from the governor. This frustrated Dr. Lummers because she had commanded many virus battles before, but she never expected to fail this time. Lex comforted her, saying that the people in the containment area still needed her. But he was wrong. The quarantine people didn't need anyone, they just wanted freedom. The rampaging refugees began to dismantle the fence and tried their best to escape the blockade. Some even tried to climb over the fence. At this time, the military was ready to suppress the riots at the gate. The death squad rushed into the crowd and closed the exit. However, their arrival made the situation more chaotic. Innocent people shouted for help, while others took the opportunity to run away with goods. Pregnant Teresa was knocked down, and no one helped her, but fortunately Xander found her in time. The crowd began to rush towards the soldiers, and some of them were infected. The soldiers had no choice but to shoot and kill, but the people still tried to rush towards the exit, regardless of their own safety. The soldiers saw that the situation was completely out of control, so they could only fire warning shots to scare them away. The people then retreated back into the container, leaving a mess behind. Jake finally found Katie, who was holding a dead student in her arms, with a sad expression on her face. However, Jake begged her to put the person down because the student had been infected. Katie immediately remembered that the student had had contact with Thomas. She hurried back to the hospital and washed the bloodstains off her body with hot water. Jake was distressed and afraid of losing his beloved. At this time, the turmoil in the isolation zone finally subsided, and the military had not yet reported to Dr. Lummers. The squad of soldiers were disinfected and isolated in a temporary tent. The next day, Dr. Lummers and Lex finished their 48-hour quarantine, and fortunately, neither of them was infected. They planned to go take a shower and then come back to deal with the mess in an hour. Lex checked his phone, only to find multiple missed calls, mostly from the vlogger Leo. Lex went straight to Leo's house. It turned out that he had not stopped working for the past 2 days and had finally found a clue. He saw in the hospital surveillance footage that patient 0, Burns, called someone as soon as he found out he was infected. It was likely that the virus creator had called him to give him some instructions. Leo immediately contacted his friend who worked in the security bureau and asked him to check Burns' phone records before and after infection. The friend quickly got results and confirmed that Burns did indeed make a call to a highly confidential number during the infection period, and the location was traced to Nantucket Island. When Leo told Lex this information, he remembered that Dr. Lummers had a villa on Nantucket Island. Leo thought she was the virus creator because his hacker friend had confirmed that the previous package bill was forged. It was an attempt to mislead everyone into thinking that Dr. Victor sent the virus to patient 0. Dr. Lummers was also the one who pinned the blame on the Syrian man. However, all of this was just speculation, and they needed more evidence to prove it. At this moment, Lex noticed a familiar symbol on the cover of the file related to patient 0. Leo seemed to have also remembered something and opened the video taken by his team member. They found there was a similar symbol, indicating that the team member might have found out something before he died. Lex thought this clue could also be useful. The squad of soldiers has been isolated for 2 days and hasn't returned home. Their families are gathering at the command post to demand an explanation. Even Dr. Lummers is helpless and can't contact the captain. It looks like she has to go there in person to give the families the truth. After this, Lex and Dr. Lummers quickly arrive at the border of the quarantine zone, surrounded by journalists, who are prevented from getting close to the tent. Dr. Lummers realizes that the situation is not good and asks the captain about the situation of the squad. Unexpectedly, he responds that 11 out of 12 soldiers have been infected, and the remaining one is soon to be infected. Dr. Lummers brings the journalists inside, deciding to reveal the soldiers' infection status. She leads the journalists to the front of a tent, where soldiers infected with the virus are inside. This is the first time the public has seen these images. Dr. Lummers makes everyone truly realize the horror of the virus, constantly boasting in front of the journalists about how correct her decision was to seal off the infection area. Otherwise, the whole city would have fallen. Previously, Lex and Leo discovered that the family member who died in the isolation area might know some important clues. So Lex arranged for Jake to visit the man's home to investigate. Jake took the task and went to the man's house to check. Strangely, the man who died on the sofa in the video was gone, disappeared along with the files, documents, and computer. Jake went to the bathroom and saw the ashes of burnt paper in the bathtub. It's clear that someone had come here beforehand and destroyed the evidence. Jake reported his findings to Lex, who believed that the mastermind behind this was probably Dr. Lummers. It was so easy for someone like her to arrange for her subordinates to sneak into the isolation area and destroy the evidence. Lex soon came to know who destroyed the evidence. It was Officer Donald, who had fallen into the isolation zone while hoisting supplies. Jake couldn't believe that his former colleague would do such a thing. Lex even thought that the satellite phone that Officer Donald brought inside can only be used with the authorization of the police chief. It might indicate that the police chief and Dr. Lummers were working together. After that, Jake found Officer Donald, who had mixed in with the robbers. Jake wanted to confront him face to face, but Officer Donald, who was now making a lot of money by selling supplies, was in high spirits and did not hide the fact that he destroyed the data. But there was no evidence, and Jake couldn't do anything to him. Outside the containment area, Lex asked Leo to check Officer Donald's debt situation. Soon after that, Leo found out that Officer Donald's house was going to be sold because he couldn't repay the loan. Later, he disguised himself as a potential buyer and found Officer Donald's wife. She told him that the mortgage had been paid off and they were no longer selling. After learning the news, Lex went to the police chief and challenged him for why Officer Donald, who was in debt, suddenly became rich after getting into the containment zone. The chief had to admit that it was Dr. Lummers who had asked him to send his men to clear away evidence that could harm the Syrian man. This was to avoid international disputes. Upon hearing this, Lex realized that even the chief was played by Dr. Lummers. The house was not where the Syrian man lived. It was all just a cover-up for Dr. Lummers' crime. Lex went to Leo's house again, and Leo was watching news on TV, praising Dr. Lummers for being brave enough to expose the truth and fight against the virus. However, Leo knew it was all just a disguise for Dr. Lummers. He decided to post online to reveal her true identity. After reading the post, Lex thought it was not appropriate, since most of Leo's post was speculation, without any solid evidence to prove that Dr. Lummers was the mastermind behind the virus. After all, Dr. Lummers was good at manipulating the public and the media. Lex told Leo to delay posting the article and decided to make one final attempt. Lex brought the evidence and confronted Dr. Lummers directly, demanding that she resign from all of her positions. Dr. Lummers was surprised and wanted to see what evidence Lex got. After reviewing it, she thought there was not enough concrete evidence to prove her crime. The fact that she owned a villa on Nantucket Island and received a private phone call from there did not necessarily mean she was the culprit. Lex knew the evidence was insufficient and mentioned her bribery of the police chief to destroy evidence in the containment zone. If the chief testified against her, the situation would be even more unfavorable for her. The only requirement that Lex had was for her to resign, and she could explain it however she liked. After some time, Dr. Lummers agreed to announce her resignation at a press conference tomorrow. In fact, Lex wanted Dr. Lummers to resign to resolve the problems in the containment zone. Previously, Dr. Lummers had been obstructing rescue and relief efforts. Her only goal was to prevent the virus from spreading, but she did not care about the people in the containment zone. At this point, teacher Katie had already been isolated for 42 hours, and there were no signs of infection so far. However, Dr. Victor warned her not to be too optimistic because she was infected by Thomas, and the incubation period of the mutant virus would be longer. Jake walked over with a smile on his face, feeling happy after seeing Katie's condition. He had gone to the supermarket to investigate information about Officer Donald and to bring some baby supplies to the pregnant Teresa. When Jake arrived at the chemical company with the supplies, he found that Teresa was about to give birth. As a police officer, Jake helped Teresa deliver the baby successfully. This was the first time Jake had witnessed the birth of a baby, so he was very happy to share it with Katie. He even imagined what it would be like for him and Katie's child in the future. However, Katie suddenly coughed. The next day, at a press conference, as promised, Dr. Lummers claimed that everyone had been misled and that patient 0 was not the Syrian man and the virus did not come from the Middle East, but from a local lab. It was the illegal research of one of their researchers that caused the virus to leak. However, Lex felt something was off because she was clearly trying to shift the blame on herself. Dr. Lummers then revealed the virus maker, Dr. Victor, who was lead researcher at the lab. She claimed that Dr. Victor lied to everyone about the virus's origin in the Middle East to cover up the truth. Lex was so angry that he left the room. He couldn't believe how shameless Dr. Lummers was. He called on Leo to publish an article accusing Dr. Lummers, but it was too late. Dr. Lummers had successfully shifted all the blame to Dr. Victor and had become a hero who dared to expose the truth. Moreover, the potential witness, the police chief, had just been promoted to a higher position in Atlanta. This must have been arranged by Dr. Lummers. Both Lex and Leo were feeling discouraged. Leo was angry and asked if Lex wanted to back down. Lex ignored him and came to his father, who was once a righteous police officer being oppressed. He strongly supported Lex to continue his investigation. He also told Lex about a high-ranking official friend who had defended himself when he was oppressed. Perhaps he could provide support now. But when the two were ready to visit the official, they found that the newly promoted police chief was chatting with him. Obviously, they had reached a consensus, and the official ignored Lex and his father, turning back to his office. The police chief advised Lex not to be too stubborn, lest he end up like his father. Without any choice, Lex had to go find Leo. At this time, his home was already deserted and in shambles. When he called Leo, he was unreachable. Lex was worried, not knowing if Leo had really run away or had been plotted against. His father advised him to either resist or flatter, and Lex chose the former without hesitation. He was determined to fight to the end for his beliefs and the people in the containment zone. Meanwhile, Katie was getting worse and probably not far from death. Of course, not only her, but many people in the containment area were struggling in the abyss of death. The mastermind behind the scenes, Dr. Lummers, was enjoying great popularity, being touted as the virus defender who dared to expose all darkness. After learning about the false accusation against himself, Dr. Victor chose to believe his mentor, who was the husband of Dr. Lummers, and would help him clear his name. Dr. Victor continued to devote himself to the development of the virus cure. Jake had been guarding Katie all along, firmly believing that she could overcome the infection. The virus was raging in the containment zone, making people suffer. But the virus maker was still at large, concealing the truth. Lex did not give up investigating the truth, and after setbacks, a turning point finally came. Sometime later, Lex received a package from the vlogger Leo, which contained a key and an address. Knowing that Leo wouldn't do anything meaningless, Lex followed the address to an abandoned warehouse. After searching for a while, he found a stored file left by Leo inside a pipeline. The file showed that Officer Donald had transferred money to another account, which in turn transferred a large sum to an anonymous account. Although Lex couldn't find any information about the anonymous account, he traced the recipient account to a family whose son was a former Army biochemical expert. Lex found this to be suspicious and immediately went to the recipient's address, where he met the mother of the expert, who said her son had worked at a chemical plant after retiring from the Army. He died in an accident a year ago, and she received a large compensation as a result. Lex felt he was on to something fishy. After obtaining the address from the old lady, Lex immediately went to the chemical plant. However, the plant had already been closed, and there was a biochemical warning sign posted at the door. He put on a hazmat suit and walked into the factory alone. It had been abandoned for a long time, and there was no one around. Lex searched every corner of the factory and finally found a skeleton in a sealed lab. It was the body of the deceased biochemical expert, and there was still some experimental information on the board. Lex understood everything and confronted Dr. Lommers. Apparently, the first infected person was not Burns, but the deceased biochemical expert. When Dr. Lommers discovered that he was infected, she immediately shut down the chemical plant, but the virus research did not stop. Later, Burns was accidentally infected during the experiment, and the virus spread out of control. Inside the containment zone, Katie's condition worsened after she accidentally contracted the virus, and Officer Jake was anxious. He kept urging Dr. Victor to think of a solution, and the doctor extracted an antibody serum from the asymptomatic carrier, Thomas. If Katie could get compatible with the serum, it might be able to overcome the virus. Jake couldn't make the decision alone, so he asked Katie. Katie said that she wanted to try as long as there was a mere chance of survival. However, she also asked Jake that if she didn't make it, he must take her son and leave the containment zone. Jake couldn't refuse her request and promised to do so while holding back his tears. Meanwhile, Dr. Victor was in agony. He had been falsely accused of being the virus maker and had been cut off from the network and phone lines. However, he did not forget his mission and prepared to inject Katie with the new antibody serum. Curious about why Dr. Victor had helped Dr. Lommers cover up the Zero patient, Katie asked him about it after hearing the truth about the virus. It's revealed that 17 days ago, Dr. Victor's mentor's wife, who is Dr. Lommers, called him and asked for his help in isolating 2 infected patients, the physician and her boyfriend Burns. Dr. Victor initially thought that they would be fine after 48 hours, but he did not anticipate that the Syrian man would become infected and spread the virus out of the hospital. Dr. Victor had to follow Dr. Lommers' advice and publicly announced that the Syrian man was the patient zero. That night, after the injection of the serum, Katie woke up from a nightmare, realizing that the medicine didn't work. Jake also realized that Katie's time was running out. He collected some things from the pediatric ward and promised to fulfill his commitment to Katie to watch a movie under the stars. Decorative lights hung in the air, like stars in the night sky. Jake and Katie sat across the glass, watching the children's animation together. Katie was deeply moved, but Jake couldn't be happy. He hoped that Katie could hold him and say those words, but he knew it was impossible. She asked Jake to bring her son to her. Jake agreed, knowing that Katie was going to leave her last words. Her son Sim came to her. Katie endured the pain and bid her final words to her son. After that, she fell on the bed, struggling in pain. When she saw Jake coming over, she managed to squeeze out a smile. Jake couldn't bear it anymore. He didn't want to watch his loved one die slowly through the glass. So he put on a protective suit and went into the isolation room to hold Katie, who was coughing up blood. Katie, lying in Jake's arms, used the last bit of her strength to express her feelings again. Soon after, he had to send Katie's body to the incinerator by himself, putting an end to Katie's life. The next day, Lex's girlfriend Jana went to the supermarket and ran into Officer Donald, who was selling things for profits. This guy was now crazed with money and told Jana that for $5,000, he could help her escape the containment zone. When Jana got back, she immediately told everyone about this. The maintenance officer took out his money, but it was only enough for 2 people to leave. Jana suggested searching the building for valuable items to exchange with Officer Donald. Fortunately, they found a valuable piece of jewelry in the safe, but they still needed to confirm with Officer Donald if it was enough for all of them. Jana and the maintenance officer went to the supermarket again and ran into Jake. It turned out that he was unable to move on after losing his loved one and was looking to buy some alcohol in the supermarket. Jana didn't hide anything from Jake and told him about Officer Donald's way out. This also gave Jake an idea. He had promised Katie to take her son out of the containment zone, so he went to Officer Donald and said that he had 2 more people who wanted to join, but he didn't have enough money. Fortunately, he quickly came up with a solution. He went to the room where the corpses were kept, and the shelves by the wall were filled with various items, which were the belongings of the deceased left behind after cremation. So he took out some valuable jewelry to exchange for a way out of the containment zone. Before leaving, Jake had to let Dr. Victor know that he held the key to mankind. However, Dr. Victor was too excited at the moment because he had just extracted an interferon from the body of Thomas. Dr. Victor believed that it was the key to killing the virus, and he was planning to use it to create new virus antibodies. Just then, the leader of the thugs barged in with his gang, shouting that they wanted to kill Dr. Victor. Since watching the news conference with Dr. Lummers, people inside the zone had directed their anger towards Dr. Victor, believing him to be responsible for the virus. They had even staged protests, demanding that he pay for his alleged crimes. Jake didn't try to defend Dr. Victor, but rather, he told him that Dr. Victor was about to develop a vaccine, and if they protected him, they would have first access to it once it was ready. This offer appealed to gang leader, and he quickly changed his stance from being a hunter to a protector. However, Dr. Victor was still agitated because the vaccine was not anywhere near ready, despite Jake's assurances that it was a necessary bluff. Jake explained that if he didn't make the offer, Dr. Victor would have been a dead man, and he had to keep his promise to Katie's son and leave the zone with him. Dr. Victor wanted Jake to stay and help him, but Jake was determined to keep his word to Katie. As Jake was packing up and getting ready to leave the hospital, he happened to see a doctor calling out to Dr. Victor. Then he removed his mask, and blood was seen oozing from his mouth. Apparently, he was also infected. Jake advised the doctor not to panic, but the doctor kept coughing up blood. When gang leader saw this, he immediately fired his gun. Although the patient fell down, blood splattered onto one of the thugs, who turned out to be gang leader's brother. Gang leader told Dr. Victor that he must save his brother at all costs. Dr. Victor had no choice but to prepare to inject him with the new virus antibody. Unfortunately, they had not been able to verify its efficacy yet, and the risk of death was high. But gang leader didn't care about any of this. At this point, Jake thought that he couldn't leave like this, because Dr. Victor would most likely be killed by gang leader, and the virus research would be ruined. So he entrusted Katie's son to Jana, who was prepared to leave, and he stayed at the hospital to protect Dr. Victor's safety. After Officer Donald happily counted his money, he greeted everyone and prepared to start the escape journey. Meanwhile, Dr. Victor had to try his luck. He mixed the serum of Thomas with interferon that can kill the virus and injected it into gang leader's brother. After operations, Thomas became sluggish due to the excessive blood draw, and gang leader's brother fell into a coma. However, not long after, the brother began to convulse with foams on his mouth and then passed away. In anger, gang leader wanted to kill Dr. Victor, but luckily Jake stepped in, telling him not to kill the only guy who could have resolved this mess. Dr. Victor was grateful to Jake, but Jake expressed his doubts. He had handled many infected corpses, but the death of gang leader's brother was completely different. Dr. Victor realized that he did not die because of virus invasion, but due to interferon rejection, indicating that the new cure had successfully killed the virus. However, the ingredients need to adapt to the human body, and this requires a lot of experimentation. Relying only on the serum of Thomas is far from enough. Jake then asked if other people in the containment zone might also carry antibodies, and sampling their blood could provide enough serum. Although the probability is very small, Jake still decided to try. As he ran to the street and approached people, Jake tried to persuade them to go to the hospital for screening, but now everyone had trouble even finding enough food to eat. After hearing Jake's request, everyone ran away. Jake was extremely frustrated because they were on the verge of developing a cure for the virus, but had to stop at this stage. Meanwhile, outside the containment zone, Lex had already investigated the truth behind the virus outbreak, which was led by Dr. Lummers. Surprisingly, the woman did not shy away from admitting Lex's assumption. However, she had her own reasons for doing so. The cost of researching a biological weapon was much lower than that of a nuclear weapon. So she would not give up the research, claiming that this was a necessary means of protecting the country and preventing biochemical attacks. Lex couldn't understand how innocent people could be sacrificed for the sake of research, and he questioned her insane logic. The woman boldly claimed that she would do whatever it takes to protect the country's safety, even if it meant sacrificing everyone in the containment zone. Just then, Dr. Lummers received an urgent call about a security breach inside the zone. Someone had escaped through the sewer pipe and was shot by the guards. Lex noticed that the deceased was not an infected person. Obviously, anyone who came out of the zone would be executed on the spot and immediately cremated. She then gathered everyone and asked them to eliminate all risks, emphasizing that this was a war that concerned millions of people. Later, soldiers arrived below the sewer pipe, and the so-called elimination of risks was to destroy all sewer pipes. Lex thought something was wrong and approached the captain. He expressed his concern that if there were people in the sewer, they would also be doomed. The captain replied that he was just following orders and intended to blow up all the sewer pipes within the day. In fact, Lex was unaware that his girlfriend was sneaking through the sewer to secretly escape the containment zone. The sewage system was like a labyrinth, but fortunately Officer Donald had been there before. He told them to keep heading north and that they would reach a specific manhole where a bribed officer would be waiting for them. However, they soon heard explosions not far away as the military was blowing up the sewer system. Officer Donald had no idea what was happening and thought it was just some construction work. Everyone panicked and the explosions kept getting louder, even causing parts of the tunnel to collapse, blocking their way back. Jana and the others had no choice but to continue forward, even though Officer Donald seemed lost and kept leading them in circles. They could still hear explosions overhead, and Jana knew they were in trouble. On the other side, Dr. Lummers began her retaliation. Just as Lex wanted to stop the military from destroying the sewer system, he suddenly received a notice from the police authority. Someone had reported that Lex was colluding with people inside the containment zone, which led to some of them escaping from the sewer. Lex was speechless at the accusation and walked away in anger. The authority took action against him and sent police officers to search Lex's home for evidence. Fortunately, Lex's father had kept a card up his sleeve and hid Dr. Lummers' criminal evidence and all recordings of conversations between Lex and her. As it turned out, Lex was not so foolish as to not leave a backup plan. However, the problem now was how to make the evidence public. It was clearly impossible to hand it over to the media or the police. Father and son both thought of the vlogger Leo again, so Lex asked his father to find him no matter what. Lex was unable to get away because he had something more important to deal with. It was indeed suspicious that someone had escaped from the sewer. Perhaps there was a mole in the containment zone. After some investigation, Lex did discover something fishy. He found the police officer who had shot and killed the escapee and coerced him to confess. As it turned out, the officer was the go-between for Officer Donald inside the zone. He thought he was helping the people inside the zone, as the escapee had been isolated for 48 hours and should not pose any threat to the outside world. Lex warned him that the escapee could be an asymptomatic carrier. He then advised the officer to stop working for them. Lex also informed him that Dr. Lummers had arranged for people to blow up the sewer. Hearing this, the officer panicked because there were still some people preparing to escape from the sewer. Lex quickly found Dr. Lummers and told her about Officer Donald, who had helped people smuggle themselves out. He also informed her that Donald was currently with these people in the sewer and that he wanted to persuade them to go back. Dr. Lummers felt somewhat guilty and gave him 1 hour to convince the people to return. Whether there were still people in the sewer or not, the detonation would be restarted after an hour. Lex immediately called his men to prepare to enter the sewer. His father called and informed him that they found the missing vlogger Leo. Lex asked his father to give the evidence to Leo and take down Dr. Lummers. Due to the numerous branches in the sewer, he instructed his men to split up and search. After a while, the contact officer met Officer Donald, who was exploring the path ahead. He also realized his mistake and wanted Officer Donald to stop his actions. However, Officer Donald shot the contact officer dead when he found out the situation was exposed. He then fled the scene. At a corner, Lex saw several fugitives, and to his surprise, they were his girlfriend Jana and her companions. Lex turned off his communication device and asked in a loud voice how they got there. Jana was excited to see Lex and replied that they were not infected and asked him to take them out. But due to the containment regulations, Lex could not let them go no matter what. Jana was somewhat speechless and asked him what he really wanted. At this moment, Dr. Lummers watched as the agreed time had arrived, but Lex still couldn't be contacted. She hesitated for a moment before ordering the captain to continue the explosion. However, a TV station exposed a recording of Dr. Lummers admitting her crimes in a private conversation with Lex. It turned out that all these materials were passed on to the internet by Leo, and this revelation ignited rage among the public. On the other hand, Jake, who was searching for the antibody carrier, faced huge setbacks, but he decided to continue his efforts and went to the crowded streets to read out the names of the deceased one by one. Then, he shouted at the crowd that the deceased's families should not let more of their loved ones die. After that, Jake repeated his call for the need for the virus antidote, urging everyone to participate in the screening to find the antibody carrier. The first group of people who came to the blood test site were none other than gang leader and several of his men. Then, more and more people walked out of the building and headed for the testing point. Gang leader even volunteered to be the security guard. Finally, they found another antibody carrier, a priest from the church, who became their new hope to defeat the virus. After the truth revelation, Dr. Lammers was taken away for investigation and was about to receive the punishment she deserved. The plan to blow up the sewer was also canceled. After accepting Lex's suggestion, Jonna and the others returned to the containment zone, with Lex joining them. Meanwhile, the development of the vaccine also made a breakthrough, providing hope for the people in the isolation zone, who were no longer waiting for death, but had a chance to live. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.